Just before we start, could you put your hand up if you're a doctor, medically qualified? So, okay, and if you're a nurse? Okay, excellent. And if you're a health professional of another variety? Excellent, okay, that's great. Now, just a little bit on background first of all. So my day job, I work for the Christian Medical Fellowship. I served initially as the head of student ministries. I've been the CEO since the year 1999. And we are a fellowship of Christian doctors throughout the UK and Ireland. We're affiliated with about 80 other national groups around the world as well. And there are 5,000 doctors, most of whom are working in the NHS, either as GPs or hospital doctors, and 800 medical students. And we've now started a nurses' work, so we have about 400 nurses as well. So that's my day job. Care Not Killing is an alliance of about 40 organisations, of which about 10 are very active. And it was set up in 2006 in order to combat Lord Joffe's assisted dying bill. And it's been going now for 12 years or so. And I've been the campaign director for that since the outset. And Care Not Killing is actually based in this building too. We just have one administrator, we have a media consultant, and then everybody else works for Care Not Killing on a pro bono, unpaid basis. And then I also chair a little group called EPC Europe, now just being in the process of being renamed ELC Europe. So it was the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition of Europe. It's now being rebranded to End of Life Care Europe. And it consists of about 10 European organisations which are working in the pro-life field, but specifically on the area of end-of-life issues. And so we meet regularly and we work together to counter threats that we see. So just definitions first of all. This is the one we're using. Euthanasia is where someone intentionally kills or takes the life of a person whose life is felt not to be worth living. So it's intentional, deliberate, and it's done for supposedly compassionate reasons. And it can be voluntary where the person asks for it. It can be non-voluntary where they are incapable of asking for it because of mental capacity issues, or it can be involuntary where they're capable of asking, but it's done anyway. And then assisted suicide is slightly different, where someone, it could be a doctor, it might be someone else, helps someone to end their own life. Now, these actions, we believe, are morally equivalent, but it's important to understand the difference in their definition, and that's because the law in Britain handles them in a very different way. So for assisted suicide, it's dealt with under the Suicide Act of 1961, and that was amended fairly recently, and it is illegal, it's a crime to encourage or to assist someone to commit suicide. And you can go to prison up to 14 years for this, but it's a discretionary sentence, which means that very few people ever get prosecuted, and those that do usually go for much less time than 14 years. On the other hand, murder, the murder law, which is not an act of Parliament but established by case law, makes it a crime intentionally to take someone's life, even for compassionate motives. And so euthanasia is dealt with under that law. And what that means practically is that it is a mandatory life sentence, which means at least 15 years. And so we might say that these acts are very similar. You could say that they're half a centimetre different, in the sense that if the person puts or takes the drink themselves, then that's assisted suicide. But if someone puts it on the patient's tongue, then that's euthanasia, you see. So it might only be 1 centimetre difference, and in terms of intention, the acts are the same, but they're treated quite differently in law. And it's because of that people have been able to argue that the whole situation is not currently fair or equitable. Now, what we're going to do is do a whistle-stop tour of the last 25 years, and what I want you to grasp really is just how much pressure there's been in so many ways to change the law in Britain. And it's a real miracle that the law has not so far changed. But if we go right back initially to 1992, there were two very important cases. One involved a man called Nigel Cox, who was a rheumatologist, and he had a patient by the name of Lillian Boys who had rheumatoid arthritis with very severe contractures, pain that was difficult to control. And one night, in desperation, he deliberately gave her a dose of potassium chloride, and she died. His intention was to end her life. And he was taken to court. He was convicted of manslaughter. They couldn't prove that he'd killed her because he falsified the death certificate and she'd already been cremated. And things might have been different had he not done that. But he was convicted of manslaughter. He had to go back and undergo a pain training course, but he didn't go to prison. And that raised questions about the law. And then the second case was Tony Bland. Now, Tony was the 95th victim of the Hillsborough disaster. And he suffered a crush injury and brain damage, and he ended up in what was known then as a persistent vegetative state, which meant that he was awake but not aware. And he was fed through a nasogastric tube. His parents wanted to remove that. He could well have lived for decades otherwise. And the case went all the way up through the courts and eventually got to the law lords. This was in the days before the Supreme Court had been established in Britain. And the law lords decided that that tube could be removed, and he died within about 2 or 3 weeks following that decision. Now, one of the many commentators say that the Bland case really changed the law in Britain appreciably. And one of the judges in the case said that he had severe misgivings about every aspect of the case. But it created a number of legal precedents which have led on to the situation we're in at the moment. And the key precedent it created was that people can remove a tube, feeding tube, in the so-called best interests of a patient who's not imminently dying. But the judges felt that they had some misgivings about how things would go in the future, and so they also established a precedent, really by convention rather than a legal precedent, that each of these cases had to go to court before it could be done in the future. And that kept the numbers of people with PVS dying from dehydration very low. In fact, there have only been 100 or so up until today in 25 years. But as we'll see, that's going to change very dramatically in the near future. So that was the Bland case. And then after those two cases, Cox and Bland, the House of Lords held a select committee and looked at the whole issue of end of life. And these were their conclusions. There should be no change in the law to allow euthanasia. Competent patients could refuse treatment. That palliative care services should be better developed. There should be more research into pain relief and symptom control. And treatment limiting decisions were not to be determined by resource availability. So this was a very, very conservative judgment by the Lords. And we can say effectively that this House of Lords report kicked the whole issue into the long grass, probably for about 10 years or so. Now, what happened after that is we had a number of decisions being made about people with brain damage who were going to court. And the goalposts very gradually began to move. And then eventually the British Medical Association put out some guidance in 1999 where they formalised this. Now, the BMA had been very strongly involved in the Bland case right at the beginning. They'd given evidence, and they were really just restating BMA policy. And it was simply that it's not always appropriate to give food and fluids, and it can be removed in a patient's best interest. That was the guts of it. And they specify that this could be done in patients with serious stroke or severe dementia who were not imminently dying within hours or days, but who would otherwise live for weeks, months, years. And then the General Medical Council in 2002, in a sense, restated these principles. So it covers situations where death's not imminent, but doctors believe a patient's condition so severe and their prognosis so poor that artificial nutrition or hydration may cause suffering or be too burdensome in relation to the possible benefits. So we've got the Tony Bland case, then we've got a number of cases going to court, and then we've got the BMA and GMC putting out guidance, and it was inevitable that there was going to be legislation that followed from that. And the Mental Capacity Act, which was passed in 2005, in a sense formalised a lot of these legal precedents. And the Mental Capacity Act underlined the principle of so-called best interests. It brought in legally binding advance refusals for food and fluids that people could establish. It established lasting power of attorney for people to make substituted decisions in people's best interests. And it also established what is now known as the Court of Protection to formalise the way in which patients could go. So we'd started to see a shift from initially just PVS to then what was called minimally conscious state, the next step back, where people were awake but only intermittently or partially aware, and then for dementia and stroke cases that were severe. So the goalposts were moving, and those were formalised in the Mental Capacity Act. And then we saw a number of cases of people with neurological conditions. Now, the drive for euthanasia back in the 80s and early 90s all came from cancer patients, but there was a real shift in the 1990s where it moved on to people with progressive neurological conditions, and particularly motor neurone disease, which is a terminal condition that people will generally die from within 18 months to a year, to 5 years after diagnosis. And you might recall some of these people because they were huge media stories and they pushed for a change in the law, but it didn't happen. The Stokes were a couple who went to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland to end their lives, very high-profile story. And Leslie Burke was a man with pro-life views who went to court to try to get a judgment to leave doctors with an obligation to provide food and fluids for him should he lose mental capacity. And he lost that case, and the judgment was that autonomy was the principal factor. So that really set the scene for the Joffe Bill, or the Joffe Bills, because there were three of them. Lord Joffe, who was a South African, initially member of the House of Lords, and he brought 3 bills in 3 years between 2003 and 2006. The first ran out of time, and then the second led on to a Lords Select Committee. So this took place in 2005, so 13 years after the Lords had first looked at it. And this time it was a lot closer. It was chaired by Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who was at the time the president of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, which is also based in this building. And you can see that they were split 7-6 against a change in the law, but very close. And it was a very comprehensive study that they did. You can see the data here, 14,000 letters and emails, 140 witnesses in 4 countries who were actually interviewed verbally, 60 formal written submissions, and then the Lords had a long debate about the issue in the Parliament, but there wasn't a bill then to consider, but it was inevitable that another bill would come forth. And then Lord Joffe brought his bill. But a couple of things happened first. So we're just now in the beginning of 2006, and there was a very high-profile suicide or assisted suicide involving a doctor called Anne Turner, who went to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland with a BBC News crew, and it was an international story. And that happened, you can see the date there, on the 24th of January. And 2 other really important things happened in that same week. The first was that the VES, the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, rebranded itself and called itself Dignity in Dying. So that was a day before, and Turner died a day later. And yes, absolutely, this was carefully orchestrated and staged. And then Care Not Killing, which I'll tell you more about later, came into being the next week. So we had wind of this, and we'd been spending 6 months preparing for it, and the battle was on at the beginning of 2006 for this bill, which eventually came to be discussed in the House of Lords. So there's a little bit more about Lord Joffe. And he was a man with very strong liberal credentials. He'd been a strong supporter of Oxfam and was also a good friend of Nelson Mandela, and it was felt that that had something to do with his views about this whole issue. And under the third of his bills, which he called the Assisted Dying for the Terminally Ill Bill, doctors could give a prescription for a lethal dose of drugs to an adult patient, so they had to be 18 or over. They had to be suffering unbearably, but that was very subjectively defined, a terminal illness, 6 months, it was defined as, who requested such prescription and who did not lack capacity to make such a request. And if it was impossible or inappropriate to take drugs by mouth, the doctor would be allowed to provide other means of self-administration. So like a syringe driver and flicking a switch. So that bill eventually came to be debated on the 12th of May in 2006. And in the lead up to it, there was a huge degree of protest. Lots of letters were written, faith leaders united against the bills. There were demonstrations outside Parliament, and peers turned out in force. It was on a Friday afternoon when normally they're off on their estates or elsewhere. But on this occasion, 250 turned up and they voted 148 to 100 against the second reading of the bill, which meant that it could not proceed any further in the House of Lords. And then what arguments held sway? It was really arguments, firstly, about good palliative care. If we look after people properly, they don't want this, so that should be our priority. And secondly, that a change in the law would put vulnerable people under pressure to end their lives out of fear of being a burden upon others. And those two arguments really held sway and persuaded members of the House of Lords. Now, part of the reason the bill had so much support was that the British Medical Association had gone neutral on this issue a year before, and the BMA actually changed its position later in the same month of June 2006 and voted really overwhelmingly against a change in the law to allow assisted suicide or euthanasia. And the BMA has remained opposed to it ever since, as have all the major medical organisations in the UK. And that's been a very powerful buttress against further weakening of the law. Now, so Joffe's bill was defeated. At that point, the medical profession was united against euthanasia and assisted suicide. And public opinion polls, however, remained strongly in favour, and they always have been 75 to 80% in favour of a change in the law. So again, that kicked the thing into the long grass for a year or two, but what happened at that point is that Dignity in Dying had a big makeover, and the person who'd led DID through the Joffe bill resigned, and they brought a new CEO in, Sarah Wotton, and they then began the barrage, which has not let up ever since then, of bills, cases, and cases in court, and high-profile suicides with huge media coverage involving people usually going to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland. So this is Sarah Wotton. She had come from campaigning on beginning of life issues, very, very closely affiliated with BPAS and other pro-abortion organisations. But since 2006, she's really devoted her life entirely to the end-of-life arena. And they are now very quickly moved up to £1 million a year turnover organisation, now about 1.5 million. They have 25 staff. It's a very slick media machine, and they have a huge number of contacts, and they keep going and going. And this is primarily why this issue is still in the news again and again and again. So the pressure to change the law is not passive, it's not just happening, it's not brought by individuals, it is being led by a very powerful, well-oiled and extremely well-funded campaigning organisation which has this end in mind. And just some of the names of people who've been involved. So again, you might remember some of these. Craig Hewitt was the first assisted suicide ever shown on television in Dignitas. Daniel James was a rugby player who was paralysed and who went with his parents' help to Switzerland to end his life. Peter and Penelope Duff, not terminally ill at all, but just tired of life. And then the bringing in of many high-profile figures, celebrities, because this was seen as a cause célèbre that people would be seen to be going really with the cultural tide by backing. And just some of the names here: Joan Bakewell, the old people's czar; John Humphreys from Radio 4; Terry Pratchett, who has since died, the novelist; Baroness Warnock, who was behind the Warnock Report in the 1980s; Philip Nitschke from Australia, and so on. So many celebrities. And then what followed them were some more attempts to change the law. And there were two attempts in Parliament, one in Westminster and one in Scotland. So Lord Falconer attempted to amend the Coroners and Justice Bill in 2009 to legalise assisted suicide. He failed. And in Scotland, Margaret MacDonald tried to do a similar thing with her end-of-life assistance bill, and she failed as well. And up until about 2010, there'd been 11 attempts in 12 years through various British parliaments. I haven't mentioned all of them. There were Wales and the Isle of Man and so on. But there were 11 attempts, and each one of them had failed to bring about a change in the law. And it was really because of that Dignity in Dying then shifted its attention from Parliament to the courts. And so then the court cases began. And the first one was Debbie Purdy, who had multiple sclerosis. She was in a wheelchair. She'd been very active, and she wanted her husband to take her to Switzerland so that she could end her own life, and she wanted to know that her husband would not be prosecuted. And she took that case to the court, and it went up all through the courts, High Court, Appeal Court, and eventually to the Supreme Court, where she won. And what she achieved was to force the Director of Public Prosecutions, who heads up the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, to produce an offence-specific policy about who he would prosecute and who he wouldn't. So he had to put it all down on paper. And so that when the police investigated any case, they would submit their file to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the CPS would decide, firstly, was there enough evidence to bring a prosecution? And secondly, and most importantly, was it in the public interest to do so? And in the interest of time, we won't look at all the criteria, but the key criterion was that if it was done, if the act was wholly motivated by compassion, quite how one knows that, but if the act was thought to be wholly motivated by compassion, then it was not in the best interest to prosecute. And so what this did was, in a sense, gave security to people helping others going to Dignitas, but it also kept the numbers very low too. And you can go to the CPS website. This is a little bit dated now from last year, but every 6 months they update the figures and they tell you how many cases there have been. So you can see here there were, from the 1st of April 2009, which is when the interim guidance went into place, up until July last year, there were 136 cases which were referred to the CPS. 85 were not proceeded with, 28 were withdrawn by the police, and there were 8 ongoing cases, and there'd only been 1 prosecution. So we have a situation where there are very few prosecutions taking place, and still a very, very limited number of cases of assisted suicide taking place. But it no doubt did weaken the law. And then we had a barrage of court cases, and in particular 3 different men, Tony Nicklinson, Lamb and Martin, eventually joined together and took a case which went right up to the Supreme Court, again trying to legalise assisted suicide, and they failed with that as well. So here's Tony Nicklinson. I'm sure that all of you will have seen him on television. He died after that Supreme Court judgment. And then we came back to Parliament again. So just 3 years ago, there were 3 bills which came through at pretty much the same time. One, Lord Falconer brought another bill in the House of Lords, and then there were bills in Scotland and in Westminster. And again, all of these were defeated. And what was interesting was that even after all these years of debate, the margins of defeat were really quite spectacular and surprised many people just how much opposition there was. So this is Harvie's bill in Scotland, MSP's Reject Assisted Suicide Scotland bill. And Harvie's bill was similar to Joffe's. They all follow a similar pattern, but it was for mentally competent adults, but he gave 16 as the limit rather than 18, with a terminal or life-shortening illness or condition who found life unacceptable. Those were the words. It was very, very vague. There were no time limits, and it was very subjectively defined. And I think that's why the Scots felt it was too dangerous to pass something that was so loose. And then following that was Rob Marris's bill, which was a lot tighter in Westminster. So 18 years or older, mentally competent adults, and they have to have 6 months less to live. But the whole thing had to be subject to the consent of 2 doctors and a High Court judge as well. And one couldn't imagine a bill that on its surface seemed to be more limited in scope with more safeguards, but it was overwhelmingly defeated, and the margin was 330 to 118, so 74% voted against this, and over half of all MPs were opposed. So I mean, not everyone turned up to vote, but this was a very high turnout for a House of Commons bill. And the amazing thing was that, firstly, every major party, with the exception of the SNP, but the Conservatives and Labour both voted a majority to reject this. And a number of significant party leaders also voted against it, including 16 cabinet ministers. And the doctors and the lawyers also in Parliament, so these people who've been legally or medically qualified beforehand and then got elected as MPs, they were largely opposed as well. And why was it defeated so heavily? Well, lots of reasons. I think the argument was one in the chamber with a lot of MPs changing their mind even on the day. There was a very good letter-writing campaign, a very powerful coalition of people worked together effectively and lobbied inside and outside Parliament. And there was a very high-profile media opposition to the bill as well. And I think at this point, we had more or less reached a tipping point on this issue where the opposition to euthanasia and assisted suicide was no longer seen as a right-wing conservative view, like, say, abortion is. But it was seen as something which MPs on all parts of the political spectrum could join together, because the argument was really one that this was about protecting vulnerable people from exploitation and abuse. And that was an argument that appealed to people both on the right and the left. And so we have this Dignity in Dying, as I say, extremely well-resourced, lots of money, lots of celebrities, with the media largely on their side, but deeply, deeply frustrated that they're unable to make any headway either in the courts or in Parliament. And so what was going to happen next? Well, there were more cases, but actually more people coming to the fray. When we were first involved in these debates back in 2006, it was really just care not killing and dignity in dying. But what we've seen over the last few years is that more and more groups have joined in, particularly on the pro-euthanasia side. And I've listed the main ones here. Dignity in Dying, Health Professionals for Assisted Dying is part of DID, but many high-profile doctors involved in that. My Life, My Decision, what used to be the Society for Old Age Rational Suicide, so that's the Fate as Friends at the End, Exit International. And what was most striking was that 2 other very powerful groups on other issues, the National Secular Society and British Humanist Association, entered the fray. And whereas Dignity in Dying had always taken the approach that if we go for a very limited change in the law, it's just for mentally competent adults 18 or over who are terminally ill, then we're much more likely to get that through. But I think because of the failure again and again and again, these other groups got impatient and they brought much more radical agendas to the table. So along with that, very powerfully supported by the media, most of which, if you look at the balance of articles, is pro a change in the law. Telegraph and Mail, you might be surprised, not be surprised to know that they were opposed to it. But most significantly, the BBC and the Times, which have a huge amount of influence, have been largely pro-euthanasia. And I put The Guardian in red there because The Guardian finds this issue very difficult. And that's because even though it's a strongly left-wing newspaper, they're very much concerned about exploitation of vulnerable people, and especially those who are disabled. And so The Guardian, almost ironically, has published a lot of stuff on both sides of the argument. But the press and media are largely pro. So you might think, well, it's all over. We've had all these cases. We've had all these high-profile people on the media, and then we've been to Parliament again and again and again and again. Surely it's time to lay down our weapons and just go with the status quo. Well, not at all. And I'd say that over the last 2 years or so, the battle's been more intense than ever. And I'll just run through very quickly some of the major pressure points at the moment, and then we'll open it up for questions. So following on from Tony Bland, first of all, so you remember anyone with PVS or MCS, now called permanent vegetative state or minimally conscious state, has to go to the Court of Protection. And then there were a couple of cases last year involving the cases known as P and M. We won't go into the details of that, but out of the second of those cases, the judge, in giving his judgment that the tube could be removed, said it's no longer necessary for any of these patients to come to the Court of Protection. These decisions can be made simply by doctors without involvement of the courts. Now, then there was another case that came up involving a banker who we know as Y. Now, he's since died, but he was a man who had a heart attack, brain damage, ended up in minimally conscious state, and his family wanted to remove the feeding tube that he had. And so they said, in view of these other cases last year, is it necessary for us to come to court to have this? And they said, no, it's not. And at that point, the official solicitor appointed by the government intervened in the case and said, no, this is of such importance that we need to go and discuss this in great depth. And so it was to go to the Court of Appeal, but it actually jumped the Court of Appeal and went straight to the Supreme Court. And most people, I think even today in Britain, aren't even aware that this case has happened, but it has huge repercussions, as we'll come back to shortly. Now, the other things that have happened over the last 12 months or so is that there's been a serious attempt to change the law on the Isle of Guernsey, which was again defeated after a 3-day debate, and many of us were involved in going over there and speaking at meetings or doing media and so on. And then a new case, Noel Conway, has been working its way up through the courts and eventually got to the Court of Appeal, where he again wanted to change the law in the same way that Marris did. So terminally ill, mentally competent adults with a high court decision, and he tried to achieve this through the courts. He was blocked. He lost his case at the Court of Appeal. And Dignity and Dying are behind this and now appealing this to the Supreme Court, but we've heard nothing for a couple of months and we don't know whether the Supreme Court will take the case on. There was another case involving a man called Omid with, again, a neurological progressive condition, which was active last year. He's since died, and that case we suspect won't go forward anymore. And then around the same time, we had the report about what was happening in Gosport, where it was found that over 450 patients had died, mainly back in the 1990s, due to intentional morphine overdose. So that this was not morphine given to alleviate pain, but actually intentionally to shorten life, many of these patients who were not in pain. And the Gosport case is still on hold. There have been no prosecutions, and we're not sure whether there will be or whether there's enough evidence to bring the principal doctor to court, Jane Barton. But this was also happened this year. Then the Falklands changed their law on assisted dying. There's only 3,000 people in the Falklands. They have 4 people in their parliament, and they voted to change the law, but only if the law in Britain changed. So it hasn't come into being. And then we came back to the case of Y. So you remember, this is a man with minimally conscious state. His family wanted to remove his feeding tube. The official solicitor intervened, and they went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Care Not Killing intervened in that case, along with the British Medical Association. And it was effectively just us against the BMA in this case. We were on the official solicitor's side, and the BMA was on the side of the NHS Trust involved. And they made a landmark ruling, and the ruling was that if the relatives and the doctors are not in disagreement, that it's in the best interests of a person with brain damage to have their feeding tube removed, then that can be done without recourse to the courts. And so there was quite a lot of media interest in this. And in the meantime, the British Medical Association had been working on new guidance in this whole area, and they produced draft guidance at the end of last year. They have now put that out for consultation, and we're waiting for the definitive guidance to come. And this story, the Daily Mail were aware of this and ran a story on this. Doctors could be allowed to end the lives of patients with dementia or other degenerative diseases if they can't feed themselves, and so on. So the BMA guidance, which we expect to come out in the middle of this month, what it's about is the circumstances where you're required to give CANH, that's clinically assisted nutrition and hydration, so food and fluids by tube, to people who are not imminently dying. So these are not people who are within days or weeks of death, but months, years, even decades in the case of PVS or MCS. And without going into detail about all the language, there were three categories really, which you could say were effectively stroke, dementia, and people with prolonged disorders of consciousness like PVS and MCS. And the guidance set out the circumstances in which the tube could be removed, and as we say, definitive guidance is expected later this month. And what the BMA guidance did was that it built on this whole body of statute and case law going right back to Tony Bland through the Mental Capacity Act and then through these recent cases. And at the moment, in order to remove food and fluids from someone who's not terminally ill, either you can do it if they have an advance directive saying should they lose mental capacity, then they'd want the tube removed. You can do it in that circumstance. Or it can be done if someone who's been given the lasting power of attorney says it would be in their best interests. But otherwise, the cases had to go to court. Now, of course, they no longer now do, and it has opened the situation whereby doctors and relatives can decide themselves. Now, how many patients are there in this situation? Well, no one really knows, but it has been said that there are quite possibly up to 24,000 people with PVS and MCS alone in Britain, and that many of these are not in hospitals but are in care homes at the moment. And then how many people with stroke and dementia who've lost capacity? Well, who knows? The statistics are not kept centrally. So this was a huge shift. And within the BMA guidance, we called it euthanasia by stealth because it was about the explicit intention of ending life of non-dying patients. And in the guidance as well, there were other concerns about the lack of conscience protection. So people who weren't prepared to go along with it had an obligation to refer to others who would. Many people had problems with that. And then another interesting thing was the falsification of death certificates. So it recommended in this guidance that when a person dies as a result of removal of food and fluids and sedation, then you don't have to put that on the death certificate as the cause of death, but you just put the underlying condition, which might be PVS or dementia or stroke. And of course, this means that there'll be absolutely no paper trail or way of tracing the numbers or what has been done. And we know at the moment, because we've been involved in correspondence with the BMA wanted, did this in consultation with the General Medical Council and the Royal College of Physicians, and we've heard since that the General Medical Council will not be putting their force behind this guidance, but the Royal College of Physicians probably will. And at the moment, what's holding it up is that the RCP, the Royal College of Physicians, have gone to the Chief Coroner to ask if it's okay for them to effectively falsify death certificates. So that's where we are at present. We wrote to the General Register Office, the GRO, which is responsible for birth and death certificates, and we said, isn't this perjury? Doctors deliberately falsifying official documents, and they wrote back to us and said, well, we only produce the certificates, it's up to the doctors to decide, which was quite interesting. Yeah.
Did they actually use that terminology, falsification?
No, that's ours.
So what terminology do they actually use?
Well, they talk about recording the underlying cause, but as you know, on a death certificate, you've got to put, they died of pneumonia as a result of disseminated cancer, and stroke was another contributing thing or something. So what they're effectively saying is that in the top box you put PVS or stroke or whatever, when we know that the patient would have lived for years or possibly even decades, and we know what killed them was actually sedation and withdrawal of fluid. Yeah. Now, what I find quite interesting about all this is that if we look at the Netherlands, where we know, we'll come back to look at the Netherlands later today, but the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, they're very open and transparent about everything they do, and you can go to their articles and peer-reviewed literature and see the exact numbers of people who've died by each means. And the Dutch say that there are 5 main methods of ending life, and they call them end-of-life decisions, with the ending life decisions, EDL, I've got the acronym there, with the explicit intention of ending life, EIEL. So they're very transparent about what they're doing, and they record these under 5 different headings. The first one is euthanasia, where a lethal injection is given. The second one is assisted suicide, where the patient takes the lethal drugs themselves. But the other 3 are quite interesting. There's intentional morphine overdose. So this is not where someone in great pain is given morphine with the intention of removing the pain and their life is possibly shortened at the end, what we call double effect. This is intentional morphine overdose with the explicit intention of ending life. And then the other 2 are withdrawal of fluid, and then the last one is what's called terminal sedation, when very large doses of sedatives are given, but short of killing someone, and usually the withdrawal of fluids and terminal sedation are combined. So what we have in effect, what we fear, is a situation, if this guidance comes out, where this will be able to happen in Britain, but it won't be recorded, and it'll be impossible to get the data from it, and there'll be no paper trail. So what's coming up? Well, Conway might go to the Supreme Court. We're expecting new bills in the Isle of Man, in Jersey, and in the Scottish Parliament, but none of them have yet hit the headlines. So there we are. There's our first section. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, but I hope what that has shown you is, firstly, that the battle has been more or less unremitting since 1992, but especially since 1906. That it's been driven by very, very powerful lobby groups, and that we're talking about a battle not just in the public sphere or media, but in the courts, in parliaments, and through very high-profile suicides, even though they're very, very small in number against the total number of deaths. Nonetheless, the impression is created that there's a huge demand for a change in the law. So any, about 5 minutes or so, questions on that. I would sum it up by saying intentionally ending someone's life through euthanasia or assisted suicide is always wrong, but withholding or withdrawing treatment is not always wrong. Sometimes it's good medical treatment, and especially when death is imminent and inevitable and the treatment imposes more burden than any benefit it brings, it is good medicine actually to stop treatment. I mean, we don't give strong chemotherapy to people with advanced cancers. We don't continue to ventilate people who are brain dead. And at the same time, right at the end of life, sometimes when food and fluid isn't even being metabolized or taken in, and it is quite appropriate, I believe, in those situations to withdraw it. But these are questions around the last days of life. We need to be very clear that what's being talked about here, from Bland all the way through to the BMA, and this is very clear in the guidance, these are people who are not imminently dying. Now, some of them are on a downward trajectory with a degenerative disease like dementia or stroke, but this is over months, years, or even longer. And of course, those with PDOC, prolonged disorders of consciousness, have a fixed neurological deficit, if you like, that's not progressing, so that they're just effectively brain damaged. Does that make it clear? So withdrawal treatment is sometimes wrong, sometimes right, depending on the clinical situation. I think letting die is sometimes wrong and sometimes right, depending on the situation. So we'd say as Christians, there is a time to die. We're all mortal, and we will all die of some disease or injury, probably, unless the Lord returns before that takes place. But we're all mortal and we're all going to die. And I think it's a judgment call. So if you as a fit young man had lobar pneumonia and I neglected to give you antibiotics, that would be profoundly negligent. On the other hand, if you were 98 years old and you had disseminated cancer and you got bronchopneumonia, then you might think that, just let her go, or let him go in this case. So I think a key question is to say, if you're being absolutely honest, what would you put on the death certificate? And if what you put on the death certificate is a natural cause, then that's very different from, dehydration as a result of me stopping fluid, for example. And remembering that these patients are not, many of them with MCS are, as I say, intermittently aware or partially aware, and a substantial proportion of them will recover as well in time. So the diagnosis and prognosis is very uncertain, and this was one of the main arguments we were bringing in court. Well, I think it's, whether it's subliminal, I think it's certainly there. And as we know, a big proportion of spending in healthcare goes on people in the last 6 months of their lives. So you could say, well, you can save an awful lot of money. And this was one of the things that we challenged the BMA on, because in their evidence to the Supreme Court, they had costed it. And they said that every patient that has to go to court costs £122,000. And that about 2/3 of that was the cost of care for the 9 months, you see, and the rest was legal costs. And the pretty clear implication was that if you could just make the decision at the outset, then you'd save a lot of money. Of course, when they were challenged on that, they denied that they were linking it. And of course, no one is going to say publicly, let's save money by allowing people to die or fast tracking them, are they? So. There's been surprisingly little media coverage on it. We've not been asked to comment on Gosport at all, which I find the whole thing quite bizarre, because when Harold Shipman was convicted, he killed, 260 people with intentional overdoses of morphine or something like that. And of course, he went to prison and he chose to take his own life. when this Gosport case emerged and it gradually came to light, there were reports, there were a lot of very concerned relatives being quoted, and then the whole thing just seems to have been on hold. I think that what the alarming thing about Gosport is the reaction to it compared to the reaction to Shipman, I think. The alarming thing about this BMA guidance is that it's now put many more thousands of people in a more dangerous situation without the court of protection there. And whereas we felt that the initial, bland judgment was deeply flawed anyway and created dangerous precedents, at least the existence of the court of protection gave an extra layer of legislative security, and it slowed these cases down because of the sheer cost and hassle of bringing them. And that now that that's gone, but also it looks like we're not going to have the benefit of a paper trail or accountability. I think we are actually entering a very dangerous period. And I'd again point to the Dutch situation and say that most people who die in the Netherlands, it's not lethal injections, it's these other methods. And we've always argued in the past, well, these things aren't happening in Britain with any frequency. But I think it's very, very difficult to sustain that argument anymore.